You are listening to a podcast from The Hindu.
I am Jacob Koshi.
And I'm Shobna Nair, and this is the
Rearview. Here we dive into the history of things, events, discoveries, and inventions.
It is not accidental that on the soil of India, the great space powers, the United States, the USSR, and France, are collaborating with us.
Today we're going to talk about one of India's most interesting and influential scientists, come technologists, and somebody who
entrepreneur
too, of course. This is Vikram Sarabhai, India's rocket man.
or as I want to call it, Vikram Sarabhai, the maverick with a mole.
You still haven't gotten over those pictures of his. You really think he's that good looking?
He's very good looking, one of the rare Indian heroes who has very sharp,
Charming.
very charming.
Yeah.
And some say that he was very effeminate, but I don't know. I
don't
find him
think
quite
so.
good looking.
But yeah, we will be talking about his charm and particularly the strategic importance that he would actually put this charm to. And now Vikram Sarabhai is somebody. I mean, we all have encountered that name. There's no Indian who cannot have encountered that name growing up.
And who's not familiar with it. And Jacob, in fact, you've lived in Ahmedabad for a very long time,
Yes,
right? So Vikram Sarabhai must have been a presence there.
Absolutely. In fact, I lived quite close to the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And this was again an institution which was pretty much founded by Vikram Sarabhai. And I used to cycle to my school, and on the way I had to pass these lush green campuses of the Ahmedabad Textile Research Association, ATIRA, as it was called. And this again was this very pioneering kind of institution. I also used to go by the Physical Research Laboratory, the cradle of India's space program. So Ahmedabad is...
Which was again set up by Sarabhai.
Yes, by Sarabhai. And in Ahmedabad, you cannot move around without having the pervasive influence of what the Sarabhais did. We can talk about that later too, because many of their achievements or what they built extended far beyond just space and management institutions. But Shobna, you've actually pondered or read through a lot of or done a lot of research on Sarabhai's interesting early years.
Yes, so let's begin right from...
Begin from the beginning.
Yeah, let's begin from the beginning. Vikram's ancestors were rich merchants belonging to the Dasa Srimali Jain sect. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. His father, Ambalal, was a remarkable man and a very unusual one for his times. He was very well read and had a wide variety of interests. In fact, he was often described as a Renaissance man.
Mm-hmm.
His parents passed away very early, and he was brought up by his paternal uncle. Unfortunately for him, when Ambalal was barely 18 years old, his uncle also passed away, and he was left in charge of two mills and a significant fortune. Now, Ambalal is known as a Renaissance man because he broke many of the existing traditions. One, after his death of his uncle, he made sure that he would marry outside of his sect, and he got his sister also married to somebody outside of their sect, community,
Very radical,
and even
individuality.
class,
Yeah.
even class, and there was a lot of anger. The Jains in fact threatened to stone his marriage procession. It was that serious. And even bolder step would be he actually helped his elder sister Anusuya escape the confines of her child marriage and put her on a boat to England. And we'll see Anusuya and Ambalal have intense fight later on in the later years.
So he grew up with the proverbial silver spoon, right?
Absolutely. Before I end the conversation on Ambalal, one small thing I want to mention, Mahatma Gandhi, when he returned to India in 1915, he wanted to set up a ashram, much like on the lines of his South African experiment. And he set up an ashram in the outskirts of Ahmedabad. But he soon ran out of money because the ashram also had Dalit residents. So his financiers just pulled out,
because of the
and
caste
because
conflicts.
of the caste context. And Ambalal was just when Gandhi was about to give up, an anonymous man in a car drops
A wad of
a wad of cash, and that keeps the ashram going. And that anonymous man was Ambalal.
I wonder how did we come to know that the anonymous man was in? Did somebody see the
Because
car symbol, the
if,
car sticker?
no, because
The only
Ambalal.
BMW in town.
Well, that too, by the way, Ambalal was the first owner of car in Ahmedabad.
Ah, so that's not very surprising then.
That's
That's
not
not
very
very
certain.
anonymous.
No,
Okay.
also
But
he,
I get the spirit.
I mean, at that point, he did not. Later on, he in fact he steadily kept financing
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi and the ashram. It was a regular thing, and that is why the ashram continued
Hmm.
there. But Gandhi was a constant presence in Sarabhai's
And
lives.
even Tagore, even I was just sometime back, I just saw this documentary where Vikram's elder sister Leena narrates some reminiscences from her childhood, and she says that Rabindranath Tagore too was a visitor to the house, and when he picked up this newborn boy, and apparently he had really big ears, and Rabindranath Tagore he used to study this now discredited science called phrenology, that is the study of brain sizes and what they mean. So he said that this guy is going to be somebody of towering intellect. Apparently that's what Lena says about Rabindranath,
Clearly, Tagore
about
was
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, he was.
Yes, but since you're talking about Tagore, let me tell you, Sarabhais lived in style. Okay, they had a 21-acre home in Shahi Bagh called, suitably in colonial style, the Retreat.
Wow.
And here's the description of their home from Vikram Sarabhai's biography by Amrita Shah, released in June 2016. The entrance to his property was marked by tall gates. A long driveway led to a squat 3-storied structure topped by a turret surrounded by acre upon acre of verdant space. The simple lines and tastefully appointed interiors reflected a mix of Indian and European influences. Each of the 50 odd rooms was fitted with electric pankhas and shutters to combat the searing summer heat. Adjoining the main house was, or scattered about the property, were outhouses, garage, a swimming pool, courts for badminton and cricket.
That's a mansion, Shobna. That's certainly no house.
And they, of course, had a huge army of servants, and exotic creatures and birds roamed the extensive grounds, which were planted with all manner of trees and flowers and punctuated here and there with Greek statues, including a copy of Venus de Milo and lily ponds. This was the retreat in which, on 12th August 1990, Vikram was born.
About 5 years ago, we realized that this was going to be one of the most important peaceful applications of outer space.
I guess all of this is also particularly significant because, later on, I mean, he was somebody who grew up with wealth. He was born to wealth and born to prosperity. But all his life, I mean, he was pretty much always photographed or always seen in khadi, in the simplest home, I guess, in homespun. And this was despite being the owner of, I mean, the family that owned the Calico textile mills of Ahmedabad, which is one of the most prominent, mills of that time.
So, Jacob, before we get into his later part of life, I want to give you another slice of his childhood. He had his parents were, by today's standards, we can easily call them slightly wacky. They did not they did not like any of the schools available in Ahmedabad, and they were great believers in Maria Montessori, the Italian physicist who had structured a revolutionary system of primary education that had its motto: first the education of senses, then the education of the intellect. And accordingly, the Sarabhais set a school for their own kids, modeling on Montessori's principles. And this is where Vikram studied.
Such a richy rich syndrome, right? I don't like all the schools in my city, so I'm just going to make a school for you.
Absolutely. And he had a lab of his own, by the way. So his interest
Unbelievable.
in science was from his childhood. He was interested in tinkering, and many of us may be interested in tinkering, but it's not like our parents create a lab in our
I read he
backyards.
was obsessed with engines and machines, and I mean, again, going back to this, his sister had this interesting anecdote that even when he was in the toilet as a kid, he would constantly be tinkering with a steam engine. So yeah, he had that whole mechanical
He
thing
was
going.
also a little maverick in another sense.
Uh huh.
Once his father actually found letters coming to him on a daily basis, and he got curious as to who is writing to Vikram Sarabhai. Turns out, young Vikram was writing to himself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, notes to himself. And part of Vikram's education also consisted of an exposure to the best of the minds. You just mentioned Ravindranath Tagore, physicist Jagdish Chandra Bose, historian Jadunath Sarkar, Nobel Prize winning scientist C.V. Raman, Bharatnatyam dancer Rukmini Arundale, actor Prithviraj Kapoor, and I can go on and
That's
on
literally
and
the kind
on.
of exposure, I guess, wealth and influence brings you, right?
Yeah, and Nehru's used to live in their house. They used to look after Indira Gandhi. So imagine that just sets the foundation for his later
And this is
life.
actually so similar to in Europe. There is this entire class of aristocratic scientists. You can talk of Lord Kelvin. You can talk of Louis de Broglie. You can talk of the philosopher Wittgenstein. All of this is that kind of mold where these are these immense, born to immense wealth and privilege, and I guess the access that it brings them, turn them towards intellectual pursuits in science. So in fact, I think as far as India is concerned, Vikram Sarabhai was I mean, there's nobody else like him with this fusion
Yeah,
of
you remember
exposure.
this the whole debate we had as to why Indian aristocracy, Indian royalty did not produce scientists like the Europeans did.
Absolutely.
And
An
I,
episode, a theme for a future podcast. But
yes,
Vikram Sarabhai is the only representative of this class in history as far as we know
yeah,
now, right?
yeah. Jacob, you want to talk about Vikram's time in Cambridge?
Yeah, so here is this guy. I mean, he's obviously studied very well, and he's gravitating towards the sciences, and he goes to Cambridge. And that is where that, I mean, for men of a certain class and privilege, that's one option of what's one avenue that they go. And there he eventually starts researching into cosmic ray research. Incidentally, also the theme, the work field where his a slightly older predecessor, Homi Bhabha, and the paths of these two would cross very closely in future days. So he too started working on cosmic ray research. And basically that time it was about trying to understand these particles that are coming in from space. What was the constitution of these particles, what how what was their atomic structure, how were they distributed across the universe. And he started studying with the physicist Robert Millikan. He was the guy who came up with the term cosmic rays. And Millikan is a famous scientist. He was the guy who discovered the charge of the electron. And there's a famous oil drop experiment. I guess in school you probably, I mean, science students generally come up with that, the oil drop Millikan. But that's this kind of pedigree that he that he had. And later on he continued this, this source of work. And it's interesting because then the war breaks out, and both Bhabha and Vikram Sarabhai had to,
Yeah, they
the work was
came back.
interrupted.
In fact, Amrita Shah's book mentions that Vikram's PhD thesis, Cosmic Ray Investigation in Tropical Latitudes, the Cambridge actually could not find a oral examiner with the requisite expertise, because it was such a I won't say obscure
A little
subject,
niche, I
but
guess.
such a niche subject, and they had to actually look for an oral examiner from outside the university.
And eventually it turned out that there was Peter Blanket. He was, again, a very interesting scientist. He was from Britain. He was once part of there was a whole class of scientists in Britain who were completely who were leftists, and they were disillusioned with the lack of British socialism. So many of them actually took went to India, because where they felt like, the use of science to improve society could be best
To
applied
make
to
them better people.
make them. So there was JBS Haldane, again, a
Yeah,
very famous
we have to
botanist.
talk about Haldane
Absolutely,
at
yeah.
a later time.
But Blanket and Haldane were, were close friends. And Blanket was ultimately, he became he kind of supervised Sarabhai's thesis, and he was also very close friends with Nehru. I mean, so this all actually leads up to, how Sarabhai's was become has I mean, even as a PhD student, he was already in the reckoning for,
It feels like a cosmic coincidence.
cosmic coincidence. And they've Blanket had Nehru's ear. Nehru, with his that's why Nehru cultivated this whole romantic notion of science, that science would improve everything. All his Fabianism and his, his attraction towards scientists was influenced by Blanket, and I guess Blanket and also Bhabha and Sarabhai. So Sarabhai kind of benefited from that.
The war actually was a speed breaker in Vikram's journey, so
Hmm.
to speak, but only a minor one, because he wrote to Cambridge, and Cambridge agreed that he can carry on with his research as long as he's doing it under C.V. Raman.
Yes.
And as we just told you, C.V. Raman was, of course, an house guest at the retreat. At one point of time, he had stayed over. So Raman readily agreed to take over this young
Did he set up
boy.
his own lab or something like that?
I think so.
Okay.
And in 43, I believe he gets married, because he in fact goes straight armed with the tripos in natural sciences. He returns to India and heads straight for the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And this
Which was led
is
by Raman at that
at
time.
that point. And this is where he meets his future wife.
Mrinalini Sarabhai, the famous dancer.
Yeah. And interestingly, Mrinalini was not interested in marrying at all. She'd just discovered her passion for Bharatanatyam, and she wanted to continue dancing.
In fact, have you seen Rocket Boys? I mean, there
No,
is this
unfortunately,
famous
I haven't.
series, and it's remarkable. I think it's one of the few, it's perhaps the only television series in a mainstream media which focuses on two Indian scientists. I mean, it is on Bhabha and this thing. It's heavily fictionalized, of course, and people have taken a lot of issues to the accuracy of its depictions. Be that as may, but that has this very. I mean, it's one of these scenes where there is Mrinalini Sarabhai who is performing on stage, and Sarabhai is totally besotted with her. And
आपने नाम नहीं बताया अपना?
Mrinalini.
It's like gravity. Me. She puts lights on things I didn't know about myself.
He was a great progressive husband for his time,
Yeah.
because for this Jain family sitting at the apex of Ahmedabad society, for their daughter-in-law to dance, it was more than frowned upon.
And even today, Shobna, I mean, the Darpana Academy that was set up by Mrinalini and now furthered by Malika Sarabhai, who is her daughter and who's also a very well established, very famous dancer in her own right. It still is like this epicenter for the classical arts.
Yeah, and Sarabhai, Vikram did not let his parents' views come in the way of Mrinalini's career. And of course, they had a very problematic marriage, one can say, but we can get into that later. Let's get into Vikram the entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, that's one interesting thing. I mean, you said earlier that the war interrupted it, but what if what if it made him just become another very well established scientist? It's probably that he came back from India, and he came back at this time when, India was on the throes of independence, and there was this realization. There is also that whole other generation of scientists, as we've talked about Bose, we've got brought in Meghnad Saha, all of these people who believe that it is science that would transform this new country that is about to be birthed. And Vikram too kind of took in imbibed that spirit. And he much more than Bhabha. Bhabha was actually like more of a scientist.
We actually have been talking about Bhabha without actually introducing him. Who is Homi Bhabha?
Yeah.
In fact, they meet not just Vikram does not just meets his wife in Bangalore. He also meets Homi Bhabha in Bangalore. Bhabha is roughly 10 years his senior. Although Homi Bhabha and Vikram Sarabhai's names are taken together and they're interlinked, even in their
Just because, yeah,
in their biographies, they're often talked about.
Because Baba pretty much eventually over time it was just a given that Sarabhai would take over from Homi Bhabha, and Homi Bhabha was the OG as far as modern India's interest into science is concerned, and the extremely the close relationship that we had with Nehru. And he was the father of India's atomic energy program, the Department of Atomic Energy, the Atomic Energy Commission. And this is the umbrella organization from which eventually came everything science, that is space, electronics, uh, the science departments that we have. So this was the mothership. And Bhabha actually was, I mean, he was from a very influential Parsi family in Bombay, but and his father was a prominent barrister. But he actually would have been, I mean, there is the famous Bhabha equation that that came, and he was actually a very formidable a scientist, and would have actually but again, here's another person who came back to India, and he was the first to divert his the deep scientific knowledge, the cutting edge research that he had done, and use it to establish institutions in India, rather than be another, let's say, CV Raman, or who was all and also a through and through academic towards pretty much the end
Yeah,
of his
but
life.
Bhabha and Sarabhai were actually very, very distinct characters.
Yes.
Sarabhai, all his life, has been a reconciler. He would go out of his way to please people, to make things all right, to iron out the creases. And Bhabha was somebody who would go out of his way to rub people the wrong way. And he was Sarabhai, despite the wealth that he was born in, was deeply aware about his privilege.
Almost
Yeah,
like
and
self-conscious.
yeah, he was sort of atoning for the sins that his ancestors had
And
committed.
Baba always wore just as this most stylish suits of the day, and I don't think he ever put a dhoti or a kurta
And he
ever.
dictated his terms. I
Yeah.
mean, later on we will see when, if I'm not remembering the details very correctly, but Sarabhai wanted a 100-foot wide road in Tumba, and the Kerala government said, "Nothing doing, man. We're only giving you 60
Tumba is
foot."
where India's first rocket launching station was first established.
Yeah, and Sarabhai accepted his fate, or was okay, was amenable to it. On the other hand, Homi Bhabha dictated, "I want my helicopter to land here. I want I want flower beds next to my helicopter." He was completely feudal, and Sarabhai went out of his way not to be feudal. Anyways, that was a bit of a detour, but we should
But it
come
brings
back.
up their personalities.
Yeah, we should come back to talking about Sarabhai as the entrepreneur.
The Sarabhai group was into diverse businesses. It spanned textiles and chemicals and, medicinal drugs, so in fact his family was a little upset that, he had started off certain businesses and they thought that he would inherit this business, but he kind of chose to be a scientific institutional builder. In fact, one of his first forays, first major forays outside of establishing his businesses was the development of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and it's perhaps the most famous management school in Asia. And it's interesting that it was precisely because of Sarabhai's push that the Ford Foundation, which had initially conceived and agreed to fund the creation of two management institutes in India, they initially were just going to fund institutions in Delhi and Kolkata. But Sarabhai used all his, Gujarati political connections and his own family trust wealth, as well as funds from the Bombay state organization. And, all of these influences resulted in the creation of a management institute. I mean, this was, again, very far reaching for its time. I mean, India was just born, and
But even before, correct me if I'm wrong, but even before the IMA, I believe that Sarabhai's first institution was Atira, right?
yes, that was the textile research. And there was also the physical research laboratory. I mean, in terms of Sarabhai, it's very hard to actually keep track of all the different
Yeah, the
things
man
that he
had
was setting up
several balls up in the air
all
and
the
he
time,
was
juggling them.
juggling crazily.
He was the original 18 hours of work a day guy.
And he broke several people. I mean, again, we're going into a detour, but I will recount an interesting incident. Sarabhai called Abdul Kalam for a meeting. Guess what? At 3:30.
3 a.m.
Yes, 3:30 a.m. in Delhi's Ashoka, because he wanted to give him a new assignment.
Imagine how much fun it would be, Shobna, if your boss called you at 3:30 for filing a story. You would totally go, right? So anyway, this guy. I mean, he was that's how he set up all these institutions. So yeah, he set up this. I mean, he pioneered.
A research institute on textiles, which in fact ruffled a lot of feathers with his extended family and the mill owners of Ahmedabad. They did not like their meddling in, but eventually, the one good thing about Sarabhai is that he's very patient and persistent. He wouldn't go out of his way. He's not belligerent. He will not go and pick fights. He will not lecture you on what is right and wrong, but he will just sit back and hope that you come to see his
And
point.
it was also this, I mean, his belief in certain ideas that, I mean, the Atira was set up that to initiate, to build textile research, and using research we can better improve our mills, and that will, better improve the workers' technological awareness. And, so it was this whole idea that industry should be research organizations. So it's interesting where he got all these ideas from. And, it was for him, it was not just academies. He was very interested in practical
And building
applications.
institutions and then housing them with talent. One of the great thing about Sarabhai was that he actually had the ability to see each person for their talent and then to nurture it, because he, as I've been reading, was apparently the least insecure person. He would be happy if you can do the work better. So on one hand he had Atira, on the other hand he was constructing IIM Ahmedabad. Meanwhile, he also was responsible for Sarabhai Chemicals, the small little factory that came his way from the family's business empire. And he wanted to manufacture antibiotics in India, and which obviously would have been a great thing, but it's met with a lot of bureaucratic pushback. Uh,
And the chemical industries in Gujarat, even to this day, is a pretty formidable enterprise, especially in creating, small molecule drugs and, research, reverse engineering, you know patents. So again, it's a very long history of of chemical research in the
But
country.
while we celebrate Vikram Sarabhai, we should also talk about his failures. And I want to talk about one particular failure, which I thought was hilarious. He wanted to manufacture a food supplement called Limical.
Limical.
Yeah, so this, and he has always been a fervent faddist, and he was
I mean, he was a
he
foodie.
loved eating, but he was vain enough to watch his weight all
Yeah,
the time.
he looks positively lean, and he doesn't seem like to be the guy who'd actually go like he doesn't look like a foodie at all.
Yeah, so the another interesting anecdote about him is that he would not eat, he would only eat very little on his plate, and then he would go around picking food from other people's plate, and then he would, when people would ask him why is he doing
I'm
that,
just snacking.
he would say, not my plate, not my calorie.
Wow, that's
So he wanted a weight loss drug. He wanted to bring a weight loss drug to India. And he was very, very sure that this will fly off the shelves. Guess what? He brought the supplement, Limical, but it did not sell.
yes. This was literally India's in the 50s, where malnourishment and poverty is a recurrent theme, and we've still not even had a green revolution yet. But that's so Sarabhai. I mean, invest in something that is only going to give you returns 50 years into the
Yeah, he
future.
was just thinking ahead, man. He was just
Yes, today it would have been Ozempic. He could have been the original Ozempic guy. And look, I mean, it's one of the most sought after drugs of this day and age. But I guess you can be too early in
yeah.
in your times, right? And that characterizes his attitude towards, for example, even atomic energy and even space. Now, space is, I guess, India's most visible symbol of India's scientific achievements. And ask anybody, Vikram Sarabhai is the father of the space program. But
Yeah.
he was also extremely focused on the atomic energy aspect, because after Baba's death, in a plane crash, he was and Baba, but it was very visible that Vikram Sarabhai would be the successor to Baba. And this was also the time when Indira Gandhi, who had already become the prime minister, and Indira Gandhi was somebody again, and that's where Sarabhai belted out his charm. He actually had struck a rapport with Indira Gandhi very early on. And Indira Gandhi has actually said that he was somebody who would cheer me up on the few times that I was downtrodden. I mean, on the few times that I was downtrodden. So they had this
Yeah, he
equation
would
going on.
buy her a bucket full of red
Yeah,
roses.
such a Nehru thing, I guess. Nehru and his rose, and
Yeah, I think he was a very charming man.
yeah. So he used that, to a lot
But
of effect.
the stepping into Bhaba's shoes comes a little late, right? By then, he has his hands full with the space program, if I'm not wrong. So in 1961, Government of India and then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru entrusted the responsibility for space research and for peaceful use of outer space to the Department of Atomic Energy, then under the leadership of Homi Bhabha. In 1962, the Department of Atomic Energy set up Indian National Committee for Space Research. INCOSPAR,
Incospar, yeah.
INCOSPAR, with Vikram Sarabhai as chairman.
India still hadn't acquired its talent for acronyms then. So we just had terrible acronyms. Anyway,
We love Karan Johar is the original and the only OG
acronymizers. But
acronym.
Indian bureaucracy is legendary for its
So
acronyms.
is
But
our prime minister.
exactly.
Yeah. But for Vikram, space was not a new adventure. This is something that had been rattling away in his head for a very long time. In fact, one of his former students from PRL. By the way, he was also teaching at PRL, and he was also he had a collaboration with MIT, and he would teach. He would go and teach a
He was a
course
visiting faculty at them.
in
So
and
that all helped. I mean, that the Harvard Business School thing. So he had connections with American scientists, connections with MIT and Harvard. And also the space thing actually flowed very organically from his research, because this was cosmic rays, and looking at space, studying. He had experiments were done to where they would send balloons, to study the kind of particles that were incident at various heights in depth heights in the atmosphere. So it is kind of logical that we should be sending rockets, and to study various aspects of space. So that's why I guess the space department was something that he headed.
Yeah, so as far back as the 1950s, his former student R.G. Rastogi claims that he had heard him talking about rocket launching program by 1963. Imagine, he doesn't even have a job, but he sets a deadline that by such and such time we should be sending rockets up in the
Absolutely.
space. So the man was sort of a visionary and who was always on the move, always
And he never took a salary from any of his from these institutions that he set up, because he said that his wealth would, I mean his the wealth that he had would tide him over, and he didn't want to take money till. I don't think he ever thought of money, about money, as
yeah,
we
if
discussed.
you have pots of money like he did, I'm sure that is not front and center of your thought process.
So the mid 60s actually was a very tumultuous time. I mean, Nehru had died, and after that, Lal Bahadur Shastri also did not live very long after Tashkent. There's the war, and mysteriously, Homi Bhabha also, dies in a plane crash. There's a lot of conspiracy theories still in that timing of events. But all said and done, it was very well established that Sarabhai is would be a natural successor to Homi Bhabha. And remember, the Department of Atomic Energy is the preeminent scientific organization in this country. There is, of course, the CSIR labs, but this was the lab which had got unrestricted government funding, because, again, thanks to Nehru's romanticism with it, he had chosen to keep these departments close to him. And Bhabha and, they ensured that, that's why they kind of had a, they made full use of this privileged access of science to push their own kind of institutions. And so after Homi Bhabha's death, there was internal competition for this role, but at the end of it, Sarabhai took over this this role, and he began a new life in 1966 as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, secretary of the Department of Atomic Energy, and chairman of the Electronics Committee.
My God.
Again, this was something this, and we've not even talked about space, which is still like the Incospar, a sub department, but something that he actually was passionate about. And his role was, he had to make appointments to boards and committees among these, keep them in their sight, tapping their capabilities and making use of their networks. And plus, to add to all of this, there was a new prime minister whose own control over party was unsteady in 66 and 67, right? I mean, there were so many other priorities. There's 66, we've already
So
faced our famines.
he's working with so many variables, and of course everything, the equation is up in
Yeah,
the air.
there were already questions, because that famous question that is still asked today, that here is India mired in poverty, facing famines. We are not industrialized yet. All the Soviet and Chinese countries have built their massive steel mills and dams and all that, but here you're talking about exotic stuff like building rockets, building an atomic energy institution where you're trying to create nuclear bombs using nuclear power, nuclear reactor. I mean, this is really exotic stuff for that. I mean, that is precisely how, and it was because of people like Bhabha and Sarabhai that that relatively exotic stuff for that time actually managed to become institutions as a whole. And people like Sarabhai, they found ways to actually link even atomic energy. It was He didn't see atomic energy as merely just creating a bomb, or
Yeah, he was very against the bomb, right?
well, there's also, I mean, there is a whole pacifist argument that he was Gandhian, and
To
so
top that,
lovely.
he was from the Jain community, which
Yes,
believes in
so
nonviolence, and
that's that. But there was, I mean, there were other things as well. In fact, in his bid to show the relevance of atomic energy to agriculture, he came up with something that I call the crazy Kutch plan. So there is this there's one of these lovely books by early histories of Indian science by Robert Anderson. And in that book he details that Sarabhai wanted to fuel a high-tech revolution and an agricultural revolution. I mean, this was before the green revolution, the seed thing. So Sarabhai and Department of Atomic Energy planners decided that larger nuclear power plants, I mean they had conceived some, but they wanted bigger ones when necessary to produce more electricity. And these plants could incubate socio-economic development in poor, neglected areas of the country lacking electricity. So he's one of his plans was that he would set up an agrochemical project to surround a nuclear power plant in the hot, marshy, and remote Kutch. In fact, Kutch was this funny place that time because it was a kind of a hot spot between the ongoing
India
India-Pakistan war in
Pakistan
65,
war.
right? But he wanted to build this nuclear reactor in this place, and he expected that it was very much like the Manhattan Project,
Manhattan Project,
where
yes,
you would
yes.
move all these scientists to Los Alamos, right in the middle of a desert, to build the bomb. So he had these kinds of ideas, and he imagined that people would actually move to this deserted region, use electricity, operate fertilizer plants, desalinizing plants, and use subsurface water for
I don't know why, Jacob, but this just reminds me of that movie. Was it The Martian? I think, I'm not sure. Basically,
where he goes
trying
to
to,
Mars.
yeah, trying to
Matt
sort
Damon
of,
goes to Mars.
yes, 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 and grows potatoes.
Yeah, I
Remember?
mean, this is,
Yeah.
but in fact, a lot of it actually fructified. I mean, you had places, remote places like Tarapur, then you had Narora in Uttar Pradesh. So he envisioned
The
building
names
these.
from our textbooks.
Yes. And Kalpakam, I mean, even something like Thumba, where he set up the space, India's first early rocket launching efforts. So he was thinking of, using different parts of India, and especially remote, not just beyond the Delhi,
And
Bombay.
he was, all his life he would pressurize all his employees to think indigenous, to sort of make in India, one of the initial
Absolutely, he
supporters
was
of
very
making
much
India.
against actually. I mean, even though he believed in, even though he was promoting space science and nuclear technology, he was very insistent that stuff that should be built, could be built in India, should not be imported. So he was very insistent on that. But stuff that we needed to leapfrog, to advance, he actually thought that Indian society should be leapfrogging and not just merely imitate the developmental path that had been seen in the West. He was very, very much focused on ensuring that whatever you built, whether it's nuclear reactors or whether it is a satellite, it has to directly connect to people's lives. In fact, he was very specific that it had to directly connect to to the to farmers, to rural workers. So in his imagination, to have a satellite was the satellite television experiment, because he imagined that one day, once a satellite is able to beam signals to India, you would be able to beam programs on on
Yeah,
agriculture,
you'll have
improving
finally
agriculture
have
part.
Krishi Darshan.
Yes, that was all. And he thought we would mass communicate classroom education.
Yes, which also happened. It was called something called Gyan Vani.
I mean, that is the socialistic idea then, that
Yeah,
to
he
integrate
was
this country,
deeply Gandhian in his outlook.
but minus Gandhi's aversion to technology. Who
Yeah, yeah. No, interesting thing. Do you know that Sarabhai was part of the crew that walked along with Gandhi
Oh, really?
in Dandi
Oh
March?
my God, I
Yeah, he
missed it
was.
from the
He was just 11 years old at
maybe
that
the maybe
point.
the some obscure boy in Attenborough's Gandhi is probably Vikram
Vikram
Sarabhai, I guess.
Sarabhai. As long as he's good looking and as long as he has a mole right
I
next to
shall look out
his
for
nose.
a boy with a mole in my next viewing of Gandhi on October
Yes,
2nd.
please. And wait for him to smile because the mole disappears into the folds of his skin.
Ah, charming.
Anyways, but so he is responsible for constructing India's space program, right? He had a galaxy of very smart people working for
Kasturi
him.
Rangan and
Our
Satish
APJ
Dhawan.
Abdul Kalam.
Yeah. who was this one of the young scientists, associated with him. But again, while he initially saw the early, an early rocket sound, a Nike Apache rocket, which was that was launched out of Tumba, but he did not live long enough. In fact, one of the last things he did in life was, sign some, just before sleeping at night, he signed his document commissioning, approving some liquid nitrogen facility that was used for some, rocket or the other. And that was the last act he did, and, in Tumba. But one criticism that, I've always heard about him was that, he was a little paranoid of letting institutions slip out of his grasp. He wanted to keep space within this. He wanted to keep electronics within the Department of Atomic Energy.
At one point, I believe Prime Minister Indira Gandhi wanted to splice this, and because I think they had a argument over the nuclear bomb.
Yes, and because that was a big divisive debate in among, Indian technologists and scientists. Why should we ever have a bomb? Because there were scientists like Ramana who said that, a nuclear test would enhance India's prestige. Then there were other scientists who said that, this would establish India's position, because vis-a-vis the wars that were happening in other countries that were
But
nuclear arming themselves.
why do you think Vikram Sarabhai wasn't as keen as a man perhaps in position should have been about a nuclear bomb?
Because he had a very pragmatic approach to it. And remember, he is a businessman, he is a Gujarati businessman, and he was fully aware that, if a test were to happen, it would mean sanctions from countries like the United States and also countries in their sphere of influence, and that would mean huge embargoes on access to technology that would then be required by India to further its own technological and economic interests. And we have seen that. I mean, subsequently, after the nuclear tests of 74 and 98, India has multiple times been under technology embargoes, which of course were later lifted. But there is still a thought, a strain of belief that, we did lose out valuable time and access to material and components and know-how because of, some of these experiments. But then I guess on the other hand, actually blasting a bomb may have come with its own set of pros, that probably Sarabhai didn't see. So in the long run, it seems as if Sarabhai was wrong. I mean, things have turned out positively well.
But maybe if he had lived long enough, he would have revised his opinion. Who's to know?
Possibly. But one thing that, that we did see was, in his insistence to keep all institutions within the DAE. I mean, he actually clashed a lot with Homi Setna, who was, the director of the Atomic Energy
And who
Commission.
famously expected to be the successor of Homi Bhabha, right?
Yes, yeah. They had differences on whether reactors should be very big or very small. Setna actually opted for small reactors. Sarabhai opted for the bigger reactors. And I think in retrospect, what we have seen is that, even though India has been nuclear developed for many, many years, this dream of having cheap electricity fueled by nuclear plants and making India energy independent has never ever been fulfilled. And in fact, Setna actually had advocated smaller reactors, and now there is this whole debate about having small modular reactors, which is now in fashion again. So
And
we don't know.
the tension between them used to make it super uncomfortable for everybody around them. I believe that they had very, very heated arguments, but Vikram would sort of step in and try to be the ever reconciler that he was. That let's step out of this room and let's have a conversation in
Just
my
privately.
room. Yeah, let's just privately thrash out our differences and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the other mistakes in retrospect that he said was he was somebody against having an independent nuclear regulatory authority. Again, something that Setna pushed for. He said that there should be an authority because there were the Tarapur plant. There were when it was supposed to be a big nuclear reactor, and it did not function as it did not provide electricity. It had construction problems. I mean, there were many accidents that were taking place. So I mean, some people said that there should be an independent nuclear authority, but he said that the authority itself should be within,
Within
the
the should
DAE
be
and
the judge
atomic
and
energy.
the
Yeah.
criminal.
In these days, it would have been extremely
and and
unthinkable to
and one
have.
last bit, since we are on his shortcomings, in the space program, though he was the enduring image of Vikram Sarabhai in my head is, of course, of a good looking, pleasant rebel. He broke a lot of rules, and he also let the people around him challenge the status quo. But one apparently the working conditions in the space program was really really bad, but people were on board only because, and there were no working hours, there were no structured
He expected everybody
life.
else to work 18 hours like
18
him.
hours and more. People fainted around him. There are stories of his private secretaries falling down because they were not able to keep up with his pace. But the thing that I want to specifically talk about is that he would make uh, people compete with each other. So he will give the same task to two people and let them start a race.
A culture that's very much within the ISRO even today, as many people say.
Yeah.
So in
But
fact, Indira Gandhi actually did tell him that you should probably split space apart, keep space apart and atomic energy apart, and let somebody else handle atomic energy or space, whatever he wished. And she actually told him that if you do not do so, you will die.
there is one line from Amrita Shah's book that really jumped out at me, and I will read out. The frantic pace of Vikram's life, the distances he covered, and the vast sprawl of his involvements, the burden of his responsibility would have felled a multi limbed, many headed deity.
That's very apt. And it did feel, I mean, at 52, die at 52, seems
He
very
basically
premature.
overworked himself to death, right?
Possibly, or he had, I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but we can't speculate about the causes of what's been. But eventually, yes, it was somebody. So I guess maybe in today's times, would this have been somebody who did not have the capacity to delegate? Was this, I mean, is his greatness what we attribute to him today? Also, I mean, when Narayan Murthy talks about working 80 hours a day, or people working themselves to death now, did Sarabhai promote, is he
That
still
very
taken off?
culture.
Is he taken up as this example of, work? To be great, you need to be a, absolute
Workaholic.
non-delegator of work and be a solid, super solid workaholic. But yes, there were they were driven by he was driven by
But
a
I
certain
guess
set of
you
ideas.
can't judge them from today's standard. It was a different,
Absolutely.
it was a country under
Yeah.
construction.
But
So,
anyway, all said and done, because of the success, the space program, still, I mean, no history or no person, even the current chairman, any person who ever talks about Indian space always begins whatever lecture that they have with a hat tip to Vikram Sarabhai. And we can say that today the space program actually is far more visible, seen as far more successful than even the atomic energy program, which is like, which is pretty much faded into oblivion as far as the popular imagination goes at least.
but what a fascinating man. And of course, we can go on talking, but that's all we have time for today. Till we see you the next time. This is goodbye from me, Shobhana K. Nair.
And bye bye from me, Jacob. Thank you, listeners.